Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. I have two guests today. The first is Richard Byrne, editor of the Wilson Quarterly. The new issue just out is called Public Health in Time of a Pandemic. We're also joined by one of the contributors, John Barry, author of The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. John is also a distinguished scholar at the Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. His article in the WQ, Pandemics Then and Now, is adapted from a new afterword to his book, The Great Influenza. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Richard, let me begin with a little bit behind the scenes. You know, I love to do this and ask about your editorial process. When you're constructing the issue and you're deciding what's your lead interview or your lead article, you began with John's. What was the thinking?
Well, I feel that the pandemic really kind of broke in upon us as a country, as individuals, and it's a good thing for us to have a grounding not only in what's happening in our present moment, but what has happened to us before. And the Great Pandemic was a pivotal episode in not only American, but global history, coming at the end of a cataclysmic war. So I thought John would be the perfect person to take our readers through what the article is literally titled, A Then and Now, and it's a superb article.
It absolutely is. I mean, the context that's provided is some of the best stuff I've read since the dawn of the pandemic. And John, let me ask you first about your book, which leads to the afterword that's featured in the WQ. What was your initial interest in the great pandemic of the 1900s, or the 1918, I should say? And why did you decide to write the book in that first place?
Well, oddly enough, I intended to write about the home front in World War I, culminating in the events of 1919. 1919 is one of the most interesting years in American history. The pandemic was part of the home front, and obviously I ended up breaking that away. It was not the original intent at all. It just developed as things do.
The story took on a life of its own?
You would say that, yeah. Or to use a line from my scientist friends in basic research, you probably heard the line, you shoot an arrow into the air in basic research, wherever it lands, you paint the target.
Yep.
So cutting to the bottom line, you identify two main lessons. Those who occupy positions of authority in a society must maintain the public's trust. And the second lesson, public health measures, the so-called non-pharmaceutical remedies or interventions actually work. The question is, did we learn these lessons from what happened back then to where we are today?
Well, some did, some didn't. You know, you can look around the world and some countries have executed extremely well. I mean, Australia is incredible what they've done. Not to mention even more so South Korea and so forth, and other Asian countries. The United States, not so well. I believe that history doesn't happen. People make history. That persons in a position of power and authority have a lot of leverage as to what happened.
Is there a pattern? I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you if there a pattern, a type of nation, a type of leader, or does this come down to what you just talked about, the individual?
I think it really
as far
does
as who responded well.
Yeah, I think it really does come down to the individuals in a position of authority.
John, one of the things that really delighted me when I got your essay was your mention of Robert Frost and his experience, and I was also able to find a really terrific painting by Edvard Munch of a self-portrait in pandemic. So I guess I'm curious as to what you feel that artists and other public figures, not in a political sense, what we can learn from them about the human toll of pandemic.
Well, I mean, that's almost a trick question. You know, one of I don't really know the answer to that. Obviously, whenever people suffer, they go pretty deep within themselves. And if you're an artist, generally when you go deep within yourself, something comes out that is useful and speaks to others. Strangely enough, however, the pandemic did not produce much fiction. It actually generated a lot of pulp fiction in the 1920s. But in terms of literary fiction, very, very little. Dos Passos is one of my favorite writers. He actually got influenza on a troop ship going to Europe, one of the worst places you could get it. In his entire body of work, he wrote about 3 sentences about influenza.
I want to ask you about some of the math included in your piece. You write that Australia at the time of the writing had 909 deaths with a population, right? And within the U.S., a population 13 times that is fast approaching 600,000 deaths. And if you listen to some analysis, it's likely much higher than that. So the question is, and following through with the math, your calculation is, so the US should be at about 12,000 deaths if it handled things comparably to Australia. So what does this reveal about lessons learned, lessons applied, and which countries did the best job of doing so? Because as you point out, Australia isn't some docile country filled with people who are used to a socialist model. Quite the contrary. It's a country much like America filled with individuals.
Right. I think you just said what it points out. I think it illustrates what we've already been talking about, how important leadership is. And, to more or less quote from the piece, it's the same virus. You have the same tools to deal with it. And the results are extremely different, radically different. Again, coming down to, so it's not just the authority, but the use of messaging to get people to go along with what you're doing. In a Western culture, you certainly are not going to be able to force people into these things. You're going to have to lead them into doing the right thing. And Australia was successful. We were not.
John, Michael Lewis's recent book reminded everyone again of the profound effect that your book and your work had on political actors, including President George W. Bush. And I guess I'm curious as to what you see the role of a historian and journalist in bringing these things to the public and also having some sort of political influence, establishing some best practices and some paths forward for politicians to look at.
First, that's an excellent book. I know a lot of the people in it, particularly the 2 main figures, Richard Happett, who runs Hatchett, who runs CB in London now, and Carter Mesher. Consider them friends, or at least Richard I know better. When I write, I can't speak for other historians. When I write anything, I really write for myself. You hope people read it. You hope if you're, have a high, decent level of scholarship, fairly rigorous, that, it may have some impact. I didn't set out to write that book with any agenda other than exploring what happened. Nor do I have an agenda when I write any book. I will say when I've written a few op-eds, quite a few actually in the course of the last little over a year, those I am hoping will have impact, but they're based on, my involvement in pandemic preparedness, what I understand reality and the truth is. So I was trying to follow my own advice about telling the truth when I wrote the op-eds. Whether they had any impact, I don't know. I think for a journalist to seek to have impact, you get into a pretty scary area there ethically. You really don't want a journalist to have an agenda nor an historian. He approaches a subject with a certain amount of bias, but you try to be aware of whatever your biases are and adjust for them.
Mhm.
One of the breakdowns internationally, if you rule out just complete deniers, someone like Bolsonaro, or to some degree intermittently Donald Trump himself, the debates seem to break down along the lines of those who made health and healthcare the first priority, and those who made the economy and keeping the economy functioning the choice. Was that the way it broke down when you do your analysis? Was that a legitimate debate? Did one preclude the other?
Not at all. In fact, to again quote a line from the piece, the two are dance partners, and health takes the lead. That's a false dichotomy, and there's no antagonism between the two. There's a lot of data out there that the places that have focused on health have actually done better economically. That was true in 1918. There are several studies by contemporary economists, particularly in the last year, that looked at cities in 1918 that had restrictions in place longer and more rigorously enforced, and they did somewhat better economically in the aftermath of the pandemic. There's also data from things like Open Table comparing, Germany, for example, to the United States, and again, when you do better on the health practices, you do better economically. If Trump had figured that out, we would have a lot fewer dead Americans.
And Donald Trump might still be president. If you look at reliable exit polling, that issue, as much as any other, may have been the deciding factor in his fate.
The only time in his entire presidency that he cracked 50% in the polling was a few days after he declared war on the virus, and I think he got to like 51%.
Well, with that in mind, if you take us back in time, Trump's motivations seem to be an overt concern for the economy, and that going too far toward addressing the pandemic would damage the economy. But Woodrow Wilson, we should bring up Woodrow Wilson, who was president back in 1918, the person being honored by the institution that Richard and I work for. He had a different set of motivations, and he even addressed publicly the pandemic then less than Donald Trump did now. Can you tell our viewers what his concern was?
Well, the obvious, the war. The pandemic occurred in a context, and Wilson was somewhat of an obsessive person. Not somewhat, he was pretty obsessive, and his entire focus was on the war. And they had created an infrastructure to control thought, really, in the United States. Anything that might be interpreted as bad news was banned. In army camps, the song "I Wonder Who's Kissing Her Now" was banned, for example. There was no outright censorship in the United States, but there was a very effective patriotism. I grew up in Providence. The Providence Journal, for example, had a banner that ran above the headline every single day that said, if any German that you haven't known basically all your life, you've got to consider him a spy. So all of this context, when the pandemic fell into that, national public health leaders were saying things like, this is ordinary influenza by another name. And that was echoed almost everywhere in the country by local public health leaders and local politicians. Wilson personally never made a single public statement about the pandemic.
That's just hard to, it's almost hard to believe.
Yeah. During the Versailles Peace Conference, and we didn't get into this in the piece, but he got influenza, a fairly severe case. And, there were a lot of neurological complications in 1918, probably more so than there are with COVID, and there are a lot with COVID. And it very clearly affected his mind right in the middle of the peace conference, and I think probably affected his caving in on all the points of principle that he said the United States would go into war over.
Fascinating.
John, I'm curious because there's a sense that this moment might be a moment in which we will reevaluate and perhaps rebuild some of our governmental capacity to deal with large scale pandemics such as COVID. And and this is set against obviously some moves by the Trump administration to diminish and eliminate some of that presence at top levels of government, and also just in many American states, vast public health cuts. So I'm curious as to what your assessment of where we go from here, and knowing, and as so many of the players in pandemic awareness and prevention, can we rebuild? Is there a pathway for us to rebuild this capacity?
Yeah, sure. It takes investment, takes money, and I have every confidence that is going to be there in the immediate future. The question is, will it be there in the medium future, much less the distant future? The reason there was a national stockpile of PPEs and so forth that was drained in the 2009 pandemic was never refilled. A large reason, a major factor in that failure to refill was the Tea Party in Congress and the budget deal that they negotiated with the Obama administration to really strip down spending on everything. And that was not viewed as a priority. And of course, Trump had 3 years to refill it as well, and he didn't. It wasn't considered a priority. It will be a priority for the next 5 years, certainly, and for the next 10 years, probably. But once you get into the out years, particularly these things expire and requires maintenance. Supply chains are very efficient with just-in-time inventory systems are very efficient, but what you need is a little more inefficiency if you're going to prepare for a crisis like a pandemic. And there are a lot of other crises where inefficiency is something that you want. You want stockpiles, you want, your time in preparing for it. That may seem inefficient as opposed to putting your time into something else. So I'm an advocate of a little more inefficiencies.
Along those lines, looking ahead, your first lesson about trust. First, you have to build trust, then you have to keep it. So both are difficult to do. And trust is at a significantly historic low when it comes to government and institutions, not just in the US currently. What does history tell us about what it takes to rebuild that trust and how long it takes?
That's probably too big a question for me to answer. You hope that if you tell the truth repeatedly over time, people figure that out, and they do come to believe you. I think you start out by giving bad news up front, so that it seems that you're being candid, and hopefully you are being candid. And eventually, that and some success in what you're doing, and I think that trust develops. It's a lot easier if you start out with some trust. There are some nations in the world that have pretty good trust in government. One would be Sweden, as a matter of fact, and I think Sweden has not handled the pandemic well. they have essentially, although they don't use the term there, but they have gone the route of herd immunity. I think it's a case study that demonstrates that it does not work, that plan doesn't economically, they haven't done any better than the other Scandinavian countries. And in terms of deaths, they've done, somewhere between 6 to 11 times more deaths than their neighbors, than their immediate neighbors. But the government is trusted in Sweden, and actually critics of their approach have been, largely crucified. It's kind of funny, but such is the case.
You're right. My last question was so unfair because it's not only too big to answer in one answer, it's also big enough to be a whole series of programs. So I owe you one. I'm going to give you a question closer to home, a more finite personal question. And earlier you mentioned that the journalistic standards that you apply don't allow you or prevent you from worrying about impact. But the last lines in your piece, you reference a quote that what we learn from history, we learn is that we learn nothing from history. And then you end by writing, Hegel. And then you end by writing, maybe the world will prove him wrong next time. I wonder, do you allow yourself to be either optimistic or pessimistic in that regard when you look at all of the things that are required for you to look at to write such a book or such a piece? Optimistic or pessimistic, or do you shut that out?
Well, I come to a conclusion at the end, and while you're writing it, you see all the data. You're trying to put the data out there, and hopefully in a readable way, which usually means a narrative, as opposed to a listing of statistics. I think narratives. I'm kind of wandering from your question. I think narratives are natural, because, as I said earlier, I think history doesn't happen; people make history. So sometimes the evidence compels you in a certain direction, and you may not start out with an agenda, but there's actually I can't quote it directly, but there's a code of ethics in public health, and basically it says that sometimes evidence compels action, and that's a little different than starting out with an agenda, but it may end up forcing you, if you are ethical, to get involved in something, at least to the extent of issuing recommendations or telling people what you feel they need to know.
Well, thank you, John Barry, for joining us today and for your contribution to the current issue of the WQ. Richard, before we close, I want to ask you, for the viewers and listeners who are with us today, where can they find the Wilson Quarterly?
You can find us at wilsonquarterly.com. And when you get to the site, there's the ubiquitous hamburger menu at the top left. And if you click on that, you'll see a subscribe button. The Wilson Quarterly is digital publication. It's absolutely free. So a subscription means that you will get the next issue directly to your email box. And you'll also get a monthly WQ dispatch where we give you a sense of what we're reading and watching and give you some updates on authors such as John Barry.
But you will have to provide your own hamburger, right?
Yes.
Thanks, Richard Byrne, John Barry. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll take Richard up on his offer and take that free subscription to the Wilson Quarterly. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.